points of controversy, Nibbana and the self. Let us look once more at the questions about self, atta. In the final analysis, does Buddhism acknowledge the existence of a self? Does the Buddha's rejection of the five aggregates as self indicate that he wished us to discover a true self beyond the body-mind? Is Nibbana the ultimate self? There are several points here to bear in mind. All beliefs about the self or soul spring from bhavatana, the desire for eternal life. This desire incites one to seize something as stable and lasting, leading to suppositions, beliefs, and theories on self. Initially, one takes the body as self, but as soon as it is clear that the body cannot satisfy one's desire, one searches for something else. When even the mind cannot fulfill one's desire, one goes further, grasping, for instance, to exalted states encountered in jhana as the true self. Some define atta in a broader sense than the ego, as the source of all things, or an immortal spirit. But no matter how refined these concepts of self, they are essentially the same, in that they satisfy the craving for eternal life. The error here does not lie with the objects identified with or grasped onto as self. These phenomena exist according to their own nature. In the case that they are conditioned phenomena, sankhata dhamma, for example, they proceed according to specific causes and conditions. They require no self, no core, no essence to interfere with, overlap, or control their natural process. Any such fixed self would create chaos and conflict with the insubstantial nature of such things. The belief in such a fixed self is thus misguided and erroneous. It is the creation of an image or idea of something that does not in fact truly exist. How do people fall into this error? Its root cause is the craving for being, bhavatanha, alternatively craving for becoming, which gives rise to grasping, upadana. When people identify with things by way of grasping, regardless of whether that object is real or purely imaginary, they create a distorted perception of that thing. This distorted perception then becomes an image of self, which is cherished and falsely believed to be real. Ideas of self depend on the relationship between craving and on the subject, on the object taken to be self. The self is associated with such an object, but does not exist separate from the craving for being, the source of these beliefs. Self-perceptions, atta-sanya, self-view, atta-diti, and the grasping that leads to repeated assertions of self, atta-vadupadana, are accumulated so habitually that they become deeply lodged in the mind. When these views are contradicted, people tend to look for a loophole and search for something else to call self. The search for a replacement is proof of the urgency in maintaining a self. When the original perception of self is threatened or ruled out, the person fears annihilation and reaches for a new concept of self. The basic craving for existence and self-views are still fully intact, and nothing essentially changes by attaching to a new object. The idea of self is merely expressed in a more elaborate and detailed way. One may grasp onto an aspect of truth in this way, but it will result in a misrepresentation of that truth. Grasping at Nibbana as self results in a distorted image of Nibbana that is masked by desire, indicating that one has not yet realized true Nibbana. Any visible solution to this problem is prevented by the inability to abandon craving. One may acknowledge that one's self-view is false, but deep down this idea still conflicts with craving, and the acceptance of it is therefore not complete. When one belief is invalidated, the tendency is to search for another belief to take its place. One may also swing to the opposite extreme, the theory of nihilism. Solving this dilemma is not a matter of identifying the true self, but rather correcting the very belief in self and addressing the root of the problem, the craving, which creates ever more elaborate ideas of self. One must uproot self-view, attaditi or atanuditi, reject the belief in an enduring self or soul, attavada, and abandon the craving for existence, bhavatanha. When this craving and grasping are abandoned, the self or the ideas of self in which one invests so much importance are also relinquished. With this relinquishment, the question of self is concluded. One need not affix a concept of self onto something else. The self ceases automatically with the destruction of this native craving. Nothing more needs to be said about the self becomes meaningless. The extreme and controversial interpretation that Buddhism rejects the five aggregates as self, yet claims that Nibbana is the true self, is an error resulting from misdirected focus. Proponents of this view pay too much attention to what the Buddha rejected as self, rather than how he rejected the self and how he rejected the attachment that gives rise to the self. The reason the Buddha chose the five aggregates as the focus in the three characteristics, asserting that they are insubstantially and not truly controllable, is because the five aggregates are all that ordinary people are able to know and conceive of. They comprise all things that are generally held to be self, including experiences in jhana. The Buddha's rejection of the aggregates as self was not an encouragement to find something else to grasp onto. The aim of his teaching is precisely to eradicate self-view, self-attachment, and craving for existence, not merely to know the insubstantiality of the aggregates. If the Buddha wanted us to reject the aggregates as self in order to adopt something else as the true self, he would have made it amply clear what that is. He wouldn't have left us guessing and disputing. Non-self as part of the three characteristics is usually referred to in the scriptures in the phrase, all conditioned phenomena are impermanent, all conditioned phenomena are dukkha, all things are non-self, anatta. This passage by the Buddha shows that anatta has a range of meaning broader than anicca and dukkha. The first two clauses state that all conditioned phenomena, sankhara or sankhata dhamma, are impermanent and subject to pressure, whereas the third clause states that all dhammas, all things, both conditioned phenomena and the unconditioned, sankhata dhamma and asankhata dhamma or sankhara and visankhara are non-self. And the following passage in the Parivara of the Vinaya Pitaka clearly reiterates that Nibbana is included in the clause. All things are not self. All formations are impermanent, dukkha and non-self. Nibbana and designations are non-self. Although evidence shows that the Parivara is a later text in the Tipitaka, one must concede that this is a consensus from early pre-commentarial Buddhism. In any case, although such text material exists, one ought to define anatta with caution. Even the Buddha showed caution when discussing atta anatta. His approach can be summarized as follows. Firstly, when the listener had an adequate basis of understanding, the Buddha would explain the nature of the object held to be self, and the grasping that needs to be abandoned. As can be seen in his references to the 5 aggregates and 12 sense basis in the teaching of the 3 characteristics. Secondly, if someone asked him the isolated metaphysical question whether the self exists or does not exist, the Buddha remained silent and would not answer. At one time, the wanderer Vacchagotta approached the Buddha and asked, "Is there a self?" The Buddha was silent. Vacchagotta resumed, "Then, is there no self?" The Buddha remained silent. Vacchagotta then rose from his seat and departed. Later, Venerable Ananda said to the Buddha, "Why is it that when the Blessed One was questioned by the wanderer, he did not answer?" The Buddha replied, "If I had answered, there is a self, this would have been siding with those who are eternalists. If I had answered, there is no self, this would have been siding with those who are annihilationists." In the first manner of teaching about non-self, stated above, the Buddha points out how the things a person identifies with as self cannot be held in any real way. When a person recognizes this misapprehension, the dangers of grasping and the advantages of letting go become apparent. One understands the meaning of freedom and knows how to conduct oneself appropriately in the world, living with purpose rather than drifting aimlessly and allowing craving to develop into a more serious mental complex. By gaining understanding, a practitioner removes self-use and reduces craving for existence. At the same time, questions about self gradually dissolve. This way of explaining differs greatly from trying to answer metaphysical questions about the self, which spring from people's craving for existence, bhavatanha, or craving for extinction, vibhavatanha. The craving is tied up with fixed views, either a variant of eternalism, sasata diti, or of annihilationism, ucheda diti. Answering or repudiating these kinds of questions to someone with fixed beliefs is risky and leads to confusion. No matter how one answers, the person will base his conceptions upon established beliefs. If the answer is consistent with his views, he will take it as confirmation of his specific understanding. If inconsistent, he will conclude the opposite. For example, if one answers that the self exists, the view of a listener biased towards eternalism will be reinforced. If one negates the self, he will go to the opposite extreme and interpret this as a form of annihilationism. He may then develop the misguided idea that since no self exists, persecution of others has no consequences. Since no one acts, no one receives the fruits of action, and therefore why should one perform good deeds? People form conclusions according to their cravings and fixed opinions. These biased conclusions inevitably result in the extreme views of eternalism or annihilationism, neither of which is espoused by Buddhism. Moreover, some people may develop a phobia of extinction. Some may conclude that Nibbana equals extinction and give up practicing the Dhamma out of fear. Such reactions and views are extremely unfortunate. When someone asks whether things exist or do not exist, if one is not careful, both answers, they exist and they do not exist, may potentially cause problems. Because such answers may maintain the views of eternalism and annihilationism, one should not answer categorically. Instead, one should explain that those things people refer to as existing come into being as a result of causes and conditions. They are conditioned phenomena, sankhara, sankhata dhamma. They exist temporarily or momentarily, continually arising and passing away. They arise mutually dependent on one another, paticca samuppanna, in the form of a stream or a conditioned process. The Buddha therefore did not answer with a simple affirmative or negative. He referred to the process of origination. This form of response aims to dispel our misconceptions of things. The teachings on anatta function to remove self-concepts fabricated by craving and wrong view. With the release of attachment, the self or self-concepts cease automatically. If one comprehends anatta as the common, i.e. unawakened, belief of no self, however, then one falls into the wrong view of annihilationism. In the Sutta Nipata, the Buddha often characterizes enlightened beings as having neither atta nor nirata, having neither a self nor an absence of self. They have no thirst for being, bhavatanha, which hankers after a self, nor do they hold a view of existence, bhavaditti, which leads to a view of self, attaditti, or a view of self-extinction, uchedaditti. Another definition is that they believe neither in an existing self nor an expired self. They avoid the misinterpretation of a fixed self-identity, followed by the belief that the self has vanished. In conclusion, although the Buddha declared the truth must always be linked to practical application. He wished that those who receive his teachings apply and benefit from them. The way of explaining anatta by examining the objects a person identifies with, and by examining people's relationship to craving, intends to free the listeners from harmful views and attachments, enabling them to have a liberated heart and to prosper. Metaphysical responses, when indulged in, add to confusion and deepen wrong view. The Buddha therefore remained silent when asked such metaphysical questions. Now let us turn to the specific questions of whether Nibbana constitute a form of self, atta, or whether Nibbana is endowed with some form of substantial essence that could be described as self. First, all existing phenomena, which can be defined by the terms dhamma, thing, sabhava, existing phenomenon, or sabhava dhamma, natural phenomenon, exist according to their own inherent nature. In respect to conditioned things, sankhara, sankhata dhamma, they exist in line with their causes and conditions. Nibbana, on the other hand, is the unconditioned, sankhara, sankhata dhamma. It also exists according to its own nature, and is endowed with its own inherent attributes, self-purity and independence, as confirmed many times by the Buddha. As Nibbana exists according to its own nature, it is impossible for a self to interfere with, rule over, control, or dictate it. If a self, some form of static ruling essence, were to exist, Nibbana would not be able to exist as it does. Second, some people who discuss the questions about Nibbana and its relationship to the self do not understand these terms adequately. They lack a scholarly clarity within themselves and cause confusion for others. Until we ourselves are awakened, we can rely on the words of the Buddha used to describe and explain Nibbana. As for the term atta, self, one should define it in the context of the traditional philosophical questions posed by others to the Buddha, rather than create one's own definition or rely on ambiguous contemporary definitions of this term. Some people misunderstand this topic of the self versus selflessness, anatta, and begin to wonder, for example, whether they themselves exist or not. Ultimately, the concept of self, atta, should be understood as the belief in me, in the I, in him and her, etc., as distinct, fixed entities. In the Pali language, however, the term atta is also used to refer to the conventional sense of a self, as is clearly evident in the Buddha's teaching. One is one's own refuge, attahi attano nato. Literally, the self is the refuge of the self. Though the teachings state that, in truth, there is no abiding, fixed essence or substantial entity, the conventional designation of a self is valid and useful. In the discussion of Nibbana, however, one is examining the true nature of phenomena and asking questions. Does Nibbana constitute a self? Is Nibbana my true self? Is the realization of Nibbana the attainment of one's true self? Were Nibbana to be one's true self, it would have the power to control and dictate things according to one's desires, and the only things it would be able to direct and control are conditioned phenomena, or the five aggregates. Nibbana would thus pass over the threshold of the unconditioned and get caught up in conditioned phenomena. Were this to be true, Nibbana would utterly lose its status as the unconditioned. It would no longer correspond with Nibbana as described by the Buddha. It would no longer be Nibbana, at least not the Nibbana of the Buddha. Third, the claim that Nibbana is the self is necessarily connected to grasping and clinging. For example, to be self, there must be grasping, upadana, yet this is in conflict with reality, because the realization of Nibbana only occurs with the end of grasping, upadana. The end of grasping constitutes the realization of Nibbana. The Arahants who have realized Nibbana harbour no conception of my Nibbana, let alone Nibbana as the self. The belief in Nibbana as the self is completely incompatible with Nibbana. Fourth, if Nibbana were to exist as a separate Supreme Self, it would act as the master and principal agent, controlling and dictating all things. In this sense, it would be particular to Paramatman, Supreme Self, Primordial Self, Brahma or God, who in theistic religions is claimed to have created the world, rules over all human beings, and is Lord of the universe. Yet Nibbana is in a state of purity, happiness and independence. It is the unconditioned sankhara. It does not engage in any way with conditioned things, sankhata dhamma. It pertains to a completely different matter, to a completely different reality, which one may describe as diametrically opposed to the conditioned world. It is thus impossible for Nibbana to exist as a self. Fifth, Buddhist teachings clearly state that the belief in or attachment to self is a form of mental defilement, kilesa, and a form of grasping, upadana, clinging, incorrect adherence. In this context, the specific term atta va dupadana is used, translated as grasping to the belief in self. The craving for the self to endure and exist eternally, bhavatana, is the cause for this form of grasping. If this craving manifests by itself, one has not yet reached the full-blown problem. But if one steps beyond craving, one arrives at grasping Nibbana, which lies at the crux of the matter being discussed here. Note that the specific term for this grasping does not merely refer to a grasping to the self atta, but also includes the term vada. Here there is not grasping to the self, but rather grasping to the belief in self. In fact, no self as permanent stable entity exists. For this reason, strictly speaking, it is impossible to grasp onto a self, for essentially no such self exists. The term vada, belief, idea, doctrine, assertion, is added here for the sake of clarity. Any attachment to the belief in self, including attachment to language indicating a mistaken identification with self, is a form of mental impurity. Note that in some scriptural passages this grasping is described in a non-specific general sense. For example, in the statement, abandon the self, here it should be understood that what is meant is abandon any attachment to the belief in self. The grasping to a belief in self, atta vadu padana, is a crucial mental defilement. Listed among the 4 kinds of grasping, upadana, completely relinquished by fully awakened beings, arahants. Those who are free from any attachment to the belief in self, who do not identify with anything as a self, are by definition arahants. Those who realize Nibbana, or fully awakened arahants, do not appropriate anything as self. Even in regard to Nibbana itself, they do not consider it to be a self. Those who still grasp onto a belief in self, or who still recognize something to exist as self, are still tainted by defilement. They lack true vision. They have not yet realized Nibbana, the conditioned, no matter what these people believe to be self, even if it is Nibbana, because they have not directly realized Nibbana. Their knowledge and vision is still confined to the conditioned world. Therefore, whatever concept of self they create, even if they identify Nibbana with the self, is still bound to and comprised of conditioned phenomena. They still spin around in the realm of the 5 aggregates. If they claim that Nibbana is a self, they are grasping onto a mental image or concept of Nibbana, and such concepts are mental formations, sankhara, which are part of the 5 aggregates. To sum up with the Buddha's words, I do not see any doctrine of self that would not arouse sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, and despair in one who clings to it.